Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the DevOps Practitioner Series. Today, I have a good friend and a distinguished guest, Marc Peters, who is a fellow ambassador of the DevOps Institute, works as a lead security engineer with Technical Corporation, specifically in the US Air Force cyber weapon systems. Welcome, Marc. Thanks for taking your time and spending some time with us today on the edition of talking about DevSecOps. So, how are you
Thanks
doing
for
today?
having me. I'm doing well. It's
Nice.
nice in San Antonio. It's been a little cold. It's been about 50, 60 degrees, so it's a little colder than usual, but
Okay,
not
nice.
too bad.
And very interesting when you talk about US Air Force cyber weapon systems. It seems to be like a cool stuff that you're doing. And um,
Right? It sounds really cool. It sounds a lot cooler than it is. What it basically means, so the program we're working on is kind of an off-net SOC, right? So if you had your own security operations center and you built something where somebody could come in and do a second check on you, and that's what it is. It's some sensors, it's some servers, it's some different type of tools to go through the network and make sure that the guys who spend all their time doing it normally aren't missing anything.
Sure. So for our
And
viewers, Marc, just tell us about your journey because you have a vast experience in the US military and stuff. And that's an interesting episode of how did you kind of jump into this DevSecOps? So what is the logical flow that you had? It'd be very interesting to hear from you.
so I spent 22 years in the Air Force before I retired. And I worked all that time as an intelligence officer. And we were always responsible. You were out there with the team, and you were responsible for putting the computers together. And I said, well, intelligence information, it's the same thing, just run the computers. So I spent a lot of time with the computers. And I spent some time at NSA, about 3 years, when Cybercom first stood up, working with their cyber stuff. So I kind of got really invested in that. But as I jumped into DevOps and looking at some of these things kind of towards the end of my career, DevOps winds up a lot like you do as an intelligence professional and an intelligence operator in the Air Force. Because what you try to do is you try to take something, it makes something useful, and then you pass it over to the operators in a way that they can use it that makes it easier for everybody. So just like having the right intelligence, having the right pictures, having the right signals makes it easier for the operator to do their job, having the right development makes it easy for the ops on the other end. And that kind of flow, that being able to minimize work, is kind of the same process that I was using for a lot of things already. So it was a fairly easy transition for me.
Excellent. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around DevSecOps. Do you find um, things struggling between who has to own that particular piece of DevSecOps? Is it going to be the cybersecurity professionals who have traditionally been chief information security officers, who've been kind of the gatekeepers to make sure that, nope, we are not leaving you until you pass this security test and validations? Or would it be the onus of the developers to now look at, oh, okay, now we're done DevOps. What's a new gig? Let's move to DevSecOps. So what's your take on DevSecOps as a philosophy and the transition that you've seen ever to get into DevOps?
I think some of those questions are kind of putting the cart before the horse, right? When you ask who's responsible for doing this, you're not really making that cultural shift that you need to get there. And we talk about DevOps as a cultural shift. We talk about DevSecOps as a cultural shift. And frankly, even as a security guy, I'd rather call it DevOps all the time. I would rather be, a security SME, that subject matter expert in a DevOps team, than as a DevSecOps type practice. Because what it really means is that the security is blended in, right? We shift left, which means the developers have the tools, the operators have the dashboards, and you have an expert that you can go back to when you have questions. When I don't understand what it is, because some of the compliance and some of the other things get really heavy, right? And you want to have somebody who's done it for a lot of years, who understands the applications to the architecture, that understands that top level bit. Now, the hard part, that's the easy part for the security guy, right? The hard part is now that security guy who's been doing compliance for the last 15 years has to go back and learn the code and has to actually be able to read the code when they put him into GitLab so that he can go have the fight with the auditor about what the team is doing. I talk all the time, and I say, as a security guy, I have two roles. My first role is to go out to your auditor and the person who ensures your compliance and tell them that you're doing all the right things. And I have to be able to understand those things. And then I have to go back to the team and tell them how they're not doing as much as they should be doing, and they really need to put more in their system. And that's really that kind of DevSecOps piece.
I think that you nailed it as part of how do we make that. Do we sometimes make this security very complex that people find it? The moment you take about security, people just say, okay, that's not a stuff that is going to be easy to do. So is that a kind of a conception that with security in place, with the blended model, it reduces my cycle time? It increases my cycle time and it increases my lead time because I cannot go faster. So do you see that kind of conversations happening in when security is kind of embedded in your CI/CD pipeline?
We do see it, and that's where we talk some about risk and about mitigation, right? Like I said, our job is to help make things faster and help get into that cycle time and build the tools in the pipeline, whether they're static scanning or dynamic scanning, whatever the piece is. How do we make it faster? And the discussion I have with our developers a lot of time is, well, we're not going to fix that. It's going to take too long. I say, okay. Like, what do you mean, okay? You're the security guy. We have to fix it. I said, you do. But if you don't fix it today, we're going to take your list of these are known risks. And we'll take them up to the boss and we'll take them up to the product owner and say, hey, we are willing to release this with these known risks. Are you willing to take those risks to get your product on the market? Because it's not always about fixing everything and closing all those holes, right? It's about closing the holes I need to close that I can reasonably be assured of moving forward. The most secure system ever is the one with no users. As soon as I put users on a system, I introduce risk. And I want to have users, especially as a business.
Sure. And I think in terms of trends, and I see that you talk with a lot of these things in forums and conferences. What's the kind of some of the current landscape looking like from a DevSecOps perspective in terms of adoption? And what are some of the leading trends that you think is going to be something to watch out for, particularly with the pandemic situation, everything becoming digital and working from home? Do you see some specific trends around this space, both in federal side as well as in the private sector, as to how people are leaning towards in terms of adoption?
I'm not sure that trends is the right term because it's still new enough. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing, right? There's a lot of push here, containers, right? Kubernetes will solve it.
Right.
ML ops will solve it. AI will solve it. And everyone moves us further, but then we just get new risks and new threats.
Right.
Containers reduce the attack surfaces, but then if I have thousands of containers running and microservices running between those, I've just changed the security perspective. I haven't really done it. I don't think the security landscape ever changes. The things we do with security changes. The really big change for me is getting those security experts, getting your guys who are smart about compliance and getting them down into the development teams and getting them down to the operators kind of on a daily basis and getting that face-to-face interaction so that when they have a question, it's not a question of going to 9 different people and finding out what was the problem with the code, but they go into the GitLab and they look at the pipeline, they pull up the log and they're like, you know what, this is crap. You really can't be doing this. And telling them themselves, and that builds that trust and that expertise. I went back and forth on this for a while and I said, hey, I'm a terrible coder, right? I can look at it and I can read it and I can kind of tell you what it does, but writing from generic, Pascal, C++, Python, but I just don't, I enjoy working through it, but it's not something in my free time I'll be like, hey, you know what? I could make my window run better if I ran a Python script and blocked out the back of my screen.
Right.
It's just not there.
It's true. And the other aspects of the cultural shift, is it that easy being made? Is there anything specifically you would know to do for making that security is going to be everybody's responsibility? How do you build that cultural shift that everybody takes that owners, if not the rugged DevOps where we say the developers take that in, as an opportunity to improve themselves? But what kind of some of those techniques or facets that you have seen works to make the culture shift possible?
Well, it's slowly, right? It's not a fast shift. I think we've been doing our at the program I'm at, the DevSecOps, for about a year, and we're finally getting that trust built up to the point of, you guys are actually doing things for us. You're actually helping us out, not just blocking us off from from being where we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell had a paper in the late 1990s, a book called Outliers, and talks about perfect practice makes perfect, right? Doing something 500 times to have proficiency for it.
Absolutely.
So you got to do the same thing with security. You got to do the same thing with the interaction. You've got to have that people over processes, which means you need to talk and need to be involved in those and just kind of make things move forward that way.
And in terms of implementing DevSecOps, is implementing DevSecOps limitedly from whatever applying theory of constraint that we don't have everything fully automated and there's a lot of things. What are some of the challenges that you think in implementing DevSecOps as a philosophy, also about bringing the integration and blending security as part of the entire ecosystem and the entire value chain? Is there any kind of challenges that you see that prevents people from doing DevSecOps or the philosophy of DevSecOps better?
So there's always challenges. I mean, the biggest one is, when is it enough, right? When do I say I'm done? I went to talk to the developers and they put in SonarQube and they scan their code, they fix their code, and they're like, well, I'm done. It's like, well, but you haven't done any of the interactions, and you haven't done your lint tests, and you haven't done the other regression stuff that we need to do. They're like, well, that takes too much time.
Right.
Or it doesn't work on this one. Or I don't know how to use that tool. Or I don't know how to read the results for it. Or one of the great ones is the developers will say, hey, we put all those security tools in the pipeline. Well, that's good. Where'd you set the gate? I said, well, we set it for it runs. Yes. I'm like, well, what happened to that? Well, it runs the log and then it deletes it because it goes over memory, and we ran the security test, so we've shifted left. Like, no.
That's really, and it's true. It's true. It's absolutely true, because we say that, oh, we have a tick in the box. We've got all the tools. Pipeline is ready. That's it. We are all good to do that. So I definitely think that you're really good at really making a point there. Definition of done. How do you define that? How much is just enough from a security perspective?
Right. I mean, if you took your developer, you said, hey, I need you to write an API. And they said, here's the requirements. And you're like, great, it works. You're like, well, what does it do? Well, it doesn't do anything, but it runs. Well, but I needed it to do something, right? It needs to show me that it did something.
Correct.
It is the same thing with security. We've got to get that integration so that they understand that it's more than just a check done.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think from a DevSecOps as a DevOps transition is happening around, people are now increasingly focusing on building this as a capability, or this is still in a more infant stage where people are trying to touch the surface of what does this DevSecOps mean? Oh, we have the static code analyzers, we have the dynamic security testings and other stuff. How are you seeing people trying to cope up with this new wave?
Well, I'm probably on the wrong side, because like I said, as a security guy, I should be advocating to have Sec and DevSecOps everywhere.
Right.
But I think it needs to be simpler. I think it needs to be DevOps, right? It's about the way to do agile software development,
right,
and to be able to deliver faster value to the customer.
Right.
And that's all of what it's about, is how do I deliver to the customer? But we're all on the internet. We've all got the Internet of Things. We've all got all this data going into the system everywhere.
Right.
And we have to be able to protect that data. We have to be able to protect our customers. And we can't do that without security. Yeah. And that just has to be part of our generic process. It doesn't have to be different. It has to be, if we take data, we need to protect data. If we look at things, we need to secure them. If we put them out there, we need to make sure that the guy can't break in. If we were building houses, we put locks on the doors.
Yeah.
It should be the same with our code, right?
Absolutely. And then in terms of skills and competencies, what do you think every professional within the autonomous team, so I'm looking at a squad or a tribe within the team, what kind of skills and competencies we need to enforce or bring about, like an empowerment that will help them to look at the security aspect within the DevOps way much more profound. So is there any specific skills and competency you think should be recommended?
So it goes up and down. We used to do intelligence. We used to do threat briefings on a daily basis, right? And we'd talk about what the threats were and what the planes and the missiles and the rockets and the tanks. And I think getting to some of that would be great for some of these folks, right? You don't want to overwhelm them, but a couple minutes a day talking about security stuff, right, is there. I think it's a lot of soft skills on the security professionals. They've been working on their own side for so many years that they got to get used to working with the developers.
Right.
If anything, I say there's a larger burden on the security folks to learn what the developers are using to move forward, to be able to get into those, the Jenkins and the GitLab and the, the various tools and Cloud Bees and, whatever it is, to be able to run it and understand the outputs, right? And understand what they're looking at and what the inputs and outputs of those pieces are.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And finally, on the lessons learned, what's your kind of some of the things that you think has been absolute blinders when you've actually implemented something, and some of the lessons learned from your 2 decades of experience around the security practices?
So I've got a couple. I'm not sure how much time we have, so I'll go fast, but there's a couple we could probably share, right? One is recent, and you were talking about making our transition to DevSecOps, that we need to talk together, we need to work together. So I sit down with some of our developers and, our lead engineer, and he's like, yeah, we're going to go from Jenkins to GitLab because we think GitLab's going to be more effective. I said, great. Let's do some checks. We can sit down, we can talk about GitLab. So I look into GitLab, I talk to a couple reps, I talk to a couple government people. I come back, I said, this is great. It's got all these security tools. Here's what I need. Here's how you show me the metrics. And the engineer says, well, we already bought it. We bought the basic model because we didn't want to spend the money. And I said, well, it's security, right? I could make life easier. They're like, yeah, well, So it's a year later, we still haven't bought expanded licenses, and I'm recreating all that stuff so that I can deliver the factors I want to, right? Yeah. So that's one. The other one that people still have to remember that's very frustrating for me is that a lot of these compliance structures, especially in the federal government, are still very administrative heavy. They want you to be DevOps. They want you to deliver, daily. They want you to deliver quarterly. They want to have these things out there, but then they have a requirement that you produce, 1,700 tests that are all manual tests through that NIST 853 with individual controls and your explanation of why the control worked or it didn't work for each of those in order to release it on a daily basis. You're like, what?
That'd be insane. That'll be insane, right? The way to do that.
It's crazy. So that the audit structure and the compliance structure and the legal structure, as always, is behind the technology of how fast we can deliver to it, right? And I'd actually like to be in the point where you're so far ahead that you don't have to worry about security, because by the time the bad guys catch up to what you're doing, you're already on to your next step, right? You're already past where they wanted to be for it.
And finally,
so I think that's important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things about understanding where you are playing this whole game. So what are some of the resources that you would recommend as an ambassador of the DevOps Institute, which can help people to get a lot more understanding about the DevSecOps? I mean, obviously we know the books of the DevOps Handbook, the Unicorn and other stuff. It's absolute no-brainer where we need to hit that. Any other additional resource and aspects you think that would be good to enhance the skills of DevSecOps?
I don't know about skills. Marc Hornbeek's Engineering DevOps is another excellent one that has some great charts and stuff in there. Ben Buchanan wrote a book called The Hacker and the State just recently, which has some great stories. The stories about how the different hacks occurred and where they went through and how you walk through the process and go through it. Sandworm by Andy Greenberg about NotPetya is another good security story. And those are more in the sense of being warned about security, right?
Right.
I wrote a book when I was working on a doctorate a couple of years back called Cashing In on Cyberpower.
Right.
And I have to recommend mine, right? If I'm on the podcast, I got to talk about my book.
Sure.
And it's available on Amazon. And I looked at 10 years of cyber attacks and looked for their economic influences. And really, what changes did you see in the economy around things? And one of the best examples I found was, if you remember the Tri-Pacific Partnership, or Trans-Pacific Partnership that they were going to go through. I think Singapore might even be a signatory member, right? The big economic deal. Well, Japan got hacked by China, and they went in and they searched for TPP in all their systems, and they took out the negotiators' notes. And taking out those negotiators' notes, not knowing what they lost, Japan delayed signing by 16 months,
Wow.
which they estimate may have cost them upwards of $200 billion.
Wow.
Just because they delayed. If they'd signed it earlier, they would have had all this additional economic value, right? So there's a lot of things that we don't think about that can play from those additional security perspectives.
Excellent.
I'm trying to think of another DevOps. I got a stack on the desk, right?
Right.
DevOps Handbook and Accelerate and Phoenix Project are all up top.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. I mean, they're always pleasant read for forever. So great having you, Marc. And I think it was always fun to chat about with fellow ambassador about some of those aspects. And I'm sure that we will have a lot more to do. Anything else as final thoughts?
I've got one more for slide 3. We were talking about code. I've got Python for DevOps, right?
Excellent.
Sitting on the desk. Oreilly is great. Using Oreilly for everything. That's sitting on, PyTorch for machine learning and my SRE and my transforming to cloud native books.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of resources that I think our viewers will find it useful. And it's all about sharing knowledge, isn't it? I mean, it's all about learning and sharing from each other.
And you mentioned at the beginning, talking about getting a seat at the table, right? And being the person who represents. And it's not that in DevOps. It's the collaborative team. We all go forward as a team and we all have our responsibilities. Right. Just because I sit at the table today as the expert in something I talk about might not be that I sit at it tomorrow. Tomorrow it might be, Jane, or it might be Bob, or it might be, Moran, or whoever it is that sits at the table tomorrow. It's because they're the smartest person. And it's not always that same person driving it forward.
It's all about people at the end. It's all about people who make a difference. So thank you so much, Marc, for joining us today and sharing your insights. And I hope we'll continue to have the conversations going forward. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.